This is the Mayor of Greater Manchester, one of the UK's biggest and proudest cities, Andy Burnham. He has been absolutely everywhere in the media in the last few days, leading some people to think he's plotting a promotion into the job of Prime Minister. What is going on? We'll discuss on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Henry Zeffman is here. Hello, Henry.
Hello, Adam.
So Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, is in the news today, and everyone's talking about, is he launching a leadership bid, or is he just positioning himself for a future leadership bid for the Labour Party, if there ever is one? And I'm just thinking, going to Liverpool next week for the Labour Party conference, I remember a very similar sort of Andy Burnham circus, and I think it was in about 2022, where everyone was just chasing him around because he seemed like the next big thing. Again.
I mean, well, Andy Burnham's been the next big thing at various different points in his political career in various different ways with various different Labour leaders. But it's true that under Keir Starmer's leadership, it has become a little bit of a tradition to have Andy Burnham giving his pre-conference thoughts. That said, I think this takes it to another level, both in how explicit he's been in entertaining publicly the possibility that he might become leader, and in the moment of vulnerability for Keir Starmer that he's chosen to do it. And I think that's why so many people in Westminster or making their way to Liverpool today, who I've been speaking to, are so exercised by what he said.
And we're going to talk about politics for the first bit of this episode, and then I'll be joined by Simon Jack, our business editor, because there's lots of big business stories today. But to help us out with the politics, we're joined by Tony Diver, who is the I've mucked up your job title. Who is the Associate Political Editor at The Telegraph. Hello, Tony.
Hello.
Right. So we've got a Chief Political Correspondent and Associate Political Editor. What a lineup. So, Tony, the reason we got you in is because you've done one of the big interviews with Andy Burnham this week. Set the scene for the interview you did with him in The Telegraph.
Well, the interview took place yesterday. Andy Burnham was very kind to us, actually. Gave me a whole morning with him. I went to 2 speeches with him in the morning. First in a tech festival that was taking place in Manchester. He stood, actually, it was quite a bizarre setting. It was in an old converted bathhouse. And so he was actually giving a speech from in the swimming pool, which had no water in it. And he did this sort of quip about, he said something like, oh, I'm always causing trouble. I'm always in the political deep end. And now I'm in the real deep end.
Very smooth, very smooth.
But the reason we were there talking to him is because obviously there's this huge amount of speculation that he is going to, in some way, challenge Keir Starmer, which it comes with it lots of questions about how on earth that would actually happen, given that the process is very complex, what he would actually seek to do if he was to replace Keir Starmer, what his policy agenda would be, and whether or not he's actually going to go for it, of course, is a key question. And so in our interview published this morning, he said for the first time that Labour MPs have contacted him, urging him to challenge Starmer for the leadership. And he's never admitted that before, although he's sort of never ruled out running at some point, and he's always been clear that he ran for leadership twice in 2010 and 2015, and so maybe he'd give it a go again in the future, but he's never kind of given it this sense of immediacy. So he said that, and he also gave us a pretty good outline of what he'd try and do if he was running the country, and there were some pretty big announcements there. He said he wanted to reintroduce the top rate of tax at 50p. He said he wanted to massively increase council tax on expensive homes in London and the South East. He said he wanted to abandon first past the post altogether and introduce proportional representation and form some sort of complicated coalition with the Lib Dems and the Green Party. So there was plenty to go at, and I think it was probably the sort of most comprehensive idea of what Burnhamism is.
Oh yeah, there was so much stuff in there, and also we should say, I mean, all credit to you, Tony, but also he'd done another interview recently with the New Statesman with their editor Tom McTague, which was published yesterday, where he said a lot of extra stuff on top as well. So there's it's an Andy Burnham box set this week.
Yeah, that's right. And he's done another interview with The Guardian this afternoon in which he's talking about the 2-child benefit cap.
I've not even seen that one yet.
Okay. He's everywhere. And of course, the setting for all of this is just days before Labour Party conference starts in Liverpool, where everyone's going to be trying to get a piece of Andy Burnham.
And so, Henry, what's your take on this Andy Burnham media blitz then? Because one interpretation is that it's quite obvious kind of bid to present himself as an alternative to Starmer. Another way of looking at it is just that, well, he's got a mandate of his own. He's got a record that he's obviously very proud of, and Labour Party conference is in the northwest of England in a couple of days' time.
Look, he gave a straight answer to a straight question. Tony asked him if Labour MPs had been in touch, and he said that they had. But laying out a policy prospectus, as Tony just described, which is national in its nature, is far beyond the standard thing that you might expect a city region mayor to do in an interview in the run-up to conference. Also, by the way, the mere existence of these interviews is pretty provocative. Landing as they do just before party conference. Obviously, there's the interview with Tony. That New Statesman interview has a particular resonance, I think, for a certain kind of Labour person because it's the Bible of left liberals, and that is their conference edition of the magazine. So party members who take their New Statesman on their train or whatever journey to Labour Party conference are reading an extended feature about Andy Burnham. And Andy Burnham has been around the block, including quite a lot of time in Westminster, even if that's not now part of his brand, for a very long time. He knew he was going to be asked questions about the leadership. He had time to think in advance about how he wanted to answer those questions about the leadership, and he's answered them in such a way which has fueled, rather than snuffed out, questions about his ambitions.
And of course, Tony, the Telegraph is not necessarily the newspaper that Labour Party activists will be reading on the way to Liverpool. So it sends a message appearing in your paper as well, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know about that much. I think attendees of all conferences will be reading the Telegraph on the way.
Of course. You know the point I'm making, though.
Yes. I mean, I think both as Henry says, the existence of the interview itself and the way in which he answered those questions, he was being open. And that is part of his personal and political brand. He says when he left Westminster in 2017, he made a vow that he wouldn't be a person who speaks in the kind of mysterious language of Westminster, and he would give straight answers. And to be fair to him, that is exactly what he did, and he was very happy to talk through what he wants to do. Now, obviously, when that gets reinterpreted back into Westminster, as it has done this morning, it has some pretty serious consequences. And so what we've seen is cabinet ministers all day. First, Steve Reid this morning on the morning round, Rachel Reeves in a clip just after lunch, having to respond to his ideas and setting themselves up basically in direct opposition to one of their most high-profile elected politicians.
Well, we've seen this film a few times before. When Keir ran for the leadership, people said that Labour couldn't come back from the catastrophic defeat at the 2019 election. Then people said, he couldn't overturn that huge Conservative majority. He won a landslide victory just over a year ago, and Keir and the whole government are focusing on the change that the country voted for, including putting the money into communities like this one in Woodside, real change, making a difference to people's lives. And in the same way that this government are delivering change, I know that Andy is focused on delivering change in Greater Manchester.
And let's hear how that played out on the airwaves throughout Thursday, because Andy Burnham then popped up again doing his regular mayoral phone-in on BBC Radio Manchester. And this is how he responded to Tony's interview.
When I left Westminster, which is almost 10 years ago now, I took a vow not to speak in code, to answer honestly, as people say politicians don't do. Well, I do try and do that. So I was asked a direct question by a journalist, and I gave an honest answer, and obviously that's been reported today. MPs were in touch with me, but let me also give an honest explanation of what I said to those MPs. It's not up to me. It's not my decision. That's a matter for you, for the party in Parliament. And also I said to them, and it's got to be about more than a personality contest. The Tories were just constantly going through this at the latter end of the time that they were in government. It's got to be about a plan, a proper plan for the country and a proper plan to beat reform. And I think that's the big issue in front of us. Before you get into any other issues, it's the issue that the Labour conference in Liverpool should be completely focused on. So that's where we are this morning, Mike. And let me just finally say, I did say in the interview in the Telegraph today that I am ready to support the Prime Minister and the government.
You have been very critical of him, though.
In getting that plan together.
And that was Andy Burnham talking to the legendary Mike Sweeney at Radio Manchester on their regular phone-in. Henry, before we go any further in terms of our analysis, we should just point out the number of hoops and hurdles that Andy Burnham would have to go through to even be in a position to be a candidate in a leadership contest.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really serious hurdles. So first off, most obviously, he's not an MP. You have to be an MP to be leader of the Labour Party. And, I think you do have to be an MP to be Prime Minister, although technically you don't. And so he would have to find a way to become an MP before you even start thinking about any of this. Now, that's not straightforward because there'd have to be a vacancy, a by-election. Someone would presumably have to resign their seat. It would presumably, given his regional brand, have to be someone in Greater Manchester or at least the northwest of England. He would then have to get selected as the Labour candidate, and that's not necessarily straightforward, given that everyone would know or at least assume that him running would be because he wanted to then come to Parliament to challenge Keir Starmer to be leader. So, would the Labour Party even supply him with materials? Would he have Keir Starmer on his leaflets? How would that all work? He'd then have to, by the way, win the seat, win the by-election. Now, we don't know what constituency it would be, but the reason we're having this conversation is because the Labour Party's national polling is so bad that it's hard to think of a single by-election they could be sure of winning at this point. And then, if he did get through all of that, it'd come to Parliament. He would have to try to stand for leader, but presumably at that point, other people would start throwing their hat in the ring and would also try to become leader. So, yeah, I mean, it's difficult is an understatement.
Tony, did you discuss that kind of processology with him?
No, that's not something that Andy Burnham wants to talk about because it's a hypothetical. This is perhaps the one exception to his sort of straight-talking images. He won't be drawn on what would happen where. There's been a couple of seats that have been thrown into the mix there, but pretty much all of them, apart from Manchester Central, which is Lucy Powell's constituency, she's running for the deputy leadership at the moment, are now Reform Labour marginals. And so, that fight would be a pretty serious one, I think.
And Henry, in the other interview that Andy Burnham did with the New Statesman, there's this line that jumped out where he said, we have to stop being in hock to the bond markets. In other words, stop letting the international investors who buy government debt and basically fund the government from kind of calling the shots. What's he getting at there, and what reaction has that provoked?
I think that's been the most controversial policy line of any of these answers he's given in these interviews. I mean, actually, it's a bit hard given the briefness of the quote and we don't know the full exchange to know precisely what he's saying. But he appears to be saying that the government could borrow more money than Rachel Reeves thinks that it could. And in saying that, he is on the same side as, I think, a good, it's hard to know, but a good several dozen Labour MPs, perhaps upwards of 100 Labour MPs. But it's definitely out of line with sort of economic consensus. And you've seen Paul Johnson, the former head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, making the point. Even a member of Labour's ruling National Executive Committee saying that this is a sort of Liz Truss vision for Britain. Essentially, people arguing that the only reason that the bond markets and movements in the bond markets and the prices of or the yields of gilts are so important at the moment for the government is because the government has already borrowed so much money over a couple of decades, and it is bad judgment from Andy Burnham to have said that. And look, we've seen so many times, Adam, haven't we, how much the bond market is now a force in British politics. And remember when Rachel Reeves had the moment where she cried in the House of Commons during PMQs, and the bond markets moved in response. And, I think this is now a problem for, among other sort of more practical obstacles, for a potential Andy Burnham leadership bid, which is he would have to, I think, describe in more detail what he means by that or risk the markets getting spooked.
And we're recording this episode of Newscast, or at least this bit of it, at 3:15 on Thursday afternoon. And as we're speaking, Keir Starmer is doing that traditional thing that Labour Party leaders do before conference, which is a whole load of interviews with BBC regional political editors. And they will start coming out from about 6 p.m. So you'll be able to hear them on our TV show on BBC One. And we'll talk about it on our podcast version of that, which you'll be able to hear on Friday. Also, Tony, Keir Starmer's going to do a speech in London on Friday, which we think might feature some stuff about ID cards, maybe. Is there a chance here that actually the volume on Andy Burnham gets turned down quite a lot and the volume on Keir Starmer gets turned up, and actually things feel quite different in 2, 3, 4 days' time?
Well, I think it all depends what happens at conference, really. I mean, with Thursday afternoon, conference starts on Sunday, and the leader's speech, his speech, is not until Tuesday. And I always find with these conferences, they have a kind of vibe about them, don't they? They either feel miserable as they
And you can tell the second you walk in the door.
Yeah, you can. And you always get sort of slightly fruitcakey activists wandering around whatever party conference you're at. But there is always a mood. And, after you win an election, of course, the mood is jubilant. I think what will be interesting is to walk into that conference hall on Sunday and think, OK, well, what are people feeling? Labour members, the members who one day might be given a vote on whether to elect Andy Burnham as their leader, How do they feel about all of this? And do they feel that Starmer has done enough to kind of seize back the narrative after what has been, frankly, a pretty disastrous couple of months since summer recess?
And talking about the bond markets, Rachel Reeves does her speech as Chancellor on Monday.
Yeah, that's right. And I actually, just on this bond market point, I think we should probably point out, Tom McTagg, who wrote that interview, has come back since this quote was published to try and clarify what Andy Burnham was trying to get at. And he says that Burnham said, because so much of our economy is privatised, things that he would like to see nationalised, like rail, mail, water, other services, and because we have the first past the post system, which makes governments sometimes unstable, that is the thing that spooks the bond markets. And actually, if Westminster had more control over the economy and we had a more sort of consensual system of democracy, he thinks the bond markets would be a lot happier, and therefore you could borrow more money. That, I think, is the point that he was making. Nonetheless, as Henry says, it is like totally counter to what any economist thinks about the way the public finances should be run.
But such is the level of scrutiny on everything Andy Burnham is saying this week that the editor of the New Statesman is now having to issue footnotes to the quotes that they got in the interview. Henry, just before we wrap up this bit of Newscast, there's just some news broken about personnel in Number 10 and another high-profile person, not necessarily high-profile in the country, but high-profile in our journalistic world, leaving.
That's right. This is Steph Driver, who was Keir Starmer's Director of Communications, is leaving. Now, in the staffing shake-up a few weeks ago, an additional Director of Communications was brought in as the Executive Director of Communications, a man called Tim Allen, who last worked in Downing Street under Tony Blair. I think what's interesting here is that Steph Driver is another person who has been around Keir Starmer for a very long time, since early in his leadership. And he's been through a lot of iterations of staff, and she's been there pretty much throughout. And there are vanishingly few people like that still around. And I think it is therefore quite interesting that she will no longer be by his side. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of listeners won't really know what a Director of Communications does, or previously, in her case, his press secretary and various other things. But they are basically dealing with us all the time. And, she was, I think it's fair to say, in my experience, incredibly good at that and incredibly polite and responsive in that. But what I think will bite more for Keir Starmer and what will be more interesting to see how things go is losing her from his sort of kitchen cabinet of people who just know his mind from having accompanied him in person to all sorts of events at all days of the week for many, many years.
Right, Henry, thank you for your thoughts.
Cheers. Thank you.
And Tony, thanks for coming into the studio.
Thanks for having me.
Right, now we're going to have a 2 for the price of 1 with Simon Jack. Hello.
Hello, Adam.
That almost feels like appropriate, doesn't it, for your beat? Getting our money's worth.
Well, it's a wide brief, so you go, you help yourself.
Right, let's talk about Jaguar Land Rover first. And this is a massive story, which actually, I have to admit, it took me a little while to realise how big it was, which is this cyber attack on the JLR facility in the Midlands. Just explain to us what's actually gone on there and what the knock-on effects have been.
So at the end of August, JLR's factories, as you say, across the West Midlands were basically crippled by a cyber attack. Now, I was talking to people at the time. No one knew quite how serious it was. We're going to try and get it back on in hours rather than days. Then it was days rather than weeks. And now it's weeks rather than months. And it actually looks like it's going to be out until next month at least. So they're not building any cars. Losing about 50 million quid a day on that. They're still managing to sell some cars. And JLR is well funded. It's got a deep-pocketed parent in Tata Industries. But the big concern is the thousands of companies which supply JLR. If you imagine, this is a heart attack right at the middle of British industry, and all the arteries leading into it are getting pretty sclerotic because the suppliers and they have suppliers, and it's a real network of thousands of businesses, and they're having to send people home. In some cases, they're telling people to sign on. In other cases, they're binning agency workers first to go. And the crisis is getting very, very acute indeed. And so ministers are now scrambling around trying to find out what they can do. And there is a number of issues. Then, there's a number of ideas that have been kicking around. Now, Unite the union and other unions wanted a kind of COVID-era furlough scheme, which means the government basically directly pays the wages of the people in the supply chain.
Oh, yes, we remember it well.
Do you remember that well? It's funny. It used to be a big... Furlough was a word we borrowed from the Americans. Now we know what it means.
Yeah.
But the government didn't like the look of that. It means that people are being paid to stay at home. Not only that, but some companies, they'll do some of their work for JLR, but some of their work for other companies, and so it's not quite as simple as just furloughing a single company. So they didn't like the look of that. Then there was this idea, another COVID era idea, which was bounce back loans or government backed loans.
Remember them too?
Remember those?
All the fraud.
Yes, to the suppliers, so they can basically say they'll borrow the money, the government will guarantee that it'll get paid back, but the companies would have to pay it back themselves in the first instance. They didn't like the look of that because some of them still have those COVID era loans. So they didn't want any more debt. So the new idea that emerged yesterday, which the government confirmed it was looking at, is the government actually buying the parts directly from the suppliers, hanging on to them, and then eventually handing them over to JLR to put on the cars when they are ready to go. Now, that sounds like quite an elegant solution to me.
Quite innovative.
My first reaction, it's unusual, but my first reaction is that's kind of like a bit of bridge financing. But everyone stays at work in the supply chain. JLR has some time to get itself together, and then eventually the government gets its money back because JLR will buy the parts of blah 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 blah. You see how it will work. But I'm told by people in the industry this cannot work because so intricate and precise are the supply chains and the production schedules. You need the right part at the right time with the right code on it, arriving exactly blah, blah, blah. That's how it works. And there's no space to warehouse any of this stuff. So logistically, that looks really, really difficult. So if that doesn't work, then we're back to kind of the drawing board, and which is why everyone is kind of like, pulling their hair out, trying to figure out how to deal with this.
Yeah, and so last night, you and Chris Mason and others were reporting on this idea of buying up the parts to keep people going. Do we think that the government is going to have to go back to the drawing board now? When are they getting ready to abandon that idea?
I don't know if they're going to abandon it. I mean, you could. I mean. Maybe it's the least bad option of a number of terrible options, but logistically it would take a lot of working through. So there are no easy answers to this, and it just goes to show just how devastating these cyber attacks can be. We saw them at Marks and Spencer, didn't we? We saw them at Co-op. We've seen them in the travel industry last week in Brussels and elsewhere. And it's becoming a fact of life. And it's becoming a fact of life that people are not quite sure that they've got a playbook to defend against. And that's one of the things. And JLR, there's a couple of stories around saying JLR don't have cyber insurance, or not the right kind of cyber insurance for this. Even if JLR had the right cyber insurance, are you insuring every single supplier to you? There are some suppliers that JLR don't even know are suppliers to them, because there's a supplier over here who supplies that person, and that person supplies that person, and then they think that is their supply. It's pretty complex stuff.
Yeah, and I was chatting to Liam Byrne, the Labour MP, in that area. So he's got lots of constituents who are affected, and he's also the chair of the Business Select Committee. And he was saying they're working on a report about actually, are we going to have to come together as a country and come up with a cyber attack insurance scheme backed by the government that every company, big or small, can kind of buy into.
Yeah, it's interesting because, for example, take a different risk, which is like hurricane or earthquake risk. There are parts of the world where you pay in a certain levy into a big sort of municipal pool, if you like, to be drawn down on when those big things happen. You mentioned Liam Byrne. I mean, the Business Select Committee is meeting some of these suppliers behind closed doors, going back to a lot of people not wanting to come forward with their financial problems, from 5 to 5:30 this evening, right. Or we'll be meeting, I don't know when we're going to be broadcasting.
Podcasting world, it's going to be whenever.
But anyway, at the time of recording, it's about 2 hours away.
Yeah.
So, we'll find out, we'll get some readout from that. There's some news out of, a couple of the suppliers. They're saying they're laying off all the agency workers at a place called Linmar. The union saying there's no excuse for that. But, throughout the supply chain, agency workers, as is often the case, are the first to go. But many of them are actually, tottering on the brink of bankruptcy, and it's a major problem.
But it's so interesting because the car industry in the UK is such a big success story. Loads of jobs, churning out vehicles. It's a really cool sector of the economy. But they've been through Brexit, they've been through COVID, they've been through Trump's tariffs. And now this.
Yeah, I mean, they do. It's
very exposed to basically everything that happens in the world.
Well, when you have so many tentacles, it takes a lot of bits to make a car. And actually, in many ways, it takes a continent to build a car, to plagiarise.
I just said it takes a village in an earlier item on this programme.
Did you? Okay, well, it takes a continent to build a car. And they've got very complicated supply chains. It's all just in time. It's interesting, isn't it? Because 5 years ago, we talked about, the resilience of supply chains and people trying to because we had knockouts from ports in China and da-da-da and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they called it friendshoring, didn't they?
Yeah, friendshoring, and just the idea that, you wouldn't have all your eggs in one basket in terms of supplies. Now, I think that was because that in a way applied to having too much stuff coming from China. In this one, it's, a cyber attack actually takes down everyone within a country. So, I think this cyber attack thing, I talk to chief executives all the time, as you'd imagine, doing my day job as business editor. And I ask them, what's the one thing that keeps you awake? This is it.
Interesting, though, that it doesn't keep the country awake as a whole, though, I don't think. No. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. Right, now let's get the second product we're buying from you in our just-in-time supply chain of news stories. The battle between the government and the big pharmaceutical companies, with the NHS in the middle of it, and also lots of other investments and facilities in the middle of it too. Let's rewind a bit. Like, what's the background to why we're having to talk about this now?
Okay, the background is, for a number of years, the big pharmaceutical companies have been some low-level, mid-level grumbling about the fact that the NHS, NICE, which basically licenses drugs for use in the NHS, doesn't approve enough of their new medicines and doesn't pay enough for the ones that it does approve. And they're saying that actually we've got a domestic market here. We do lots of manufacturing. We do lots of research. You're a home market. Why don't you take more of the product which we offer? So that's been going on for some time. Now, two things have thrown that into very sharp relief and have been a catalyst for what is now what looks like a crisis in an industry that we think is one of our crown jewels. We want to be a science superpower, blah, blah, blah. Two things. One is the formula by which they calculate how much the big drug companies have to pay in a rebate to the government in order to supply the NHS above sales of a certain amount. They'll give a bit of a rebate to the government.
Because the NHS is so huge, it can get a kind of sweet deal like that.
Bulk buyer, so if and it's complicated. It depends on how many of the branded medicines you use and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, you give a bit of a rebate to them. Now, that formula is meant to spit out a rebate of somewhere around 15%. It actually came out around 22%. So they're giving almost a quarter of their revenues back to the government. So they don't like that very much. Plus, they're not approving of many of their new and often quite expensive medicines. So that's one thing. But the real catalyst was the fact that Donald Trump has come along and said, a bit like defence, Americans are fed up of subsidising, of you outsourcing to us your innovation in medicine, in the same way you do with defence, for example.
Because Americans pay a lot more for their drugs.
It can
and
be
the drug
anywhere
companies
between,
then use that to invent the new drugs. Yeah.
Exactly. It can be anywhere between 3 and 10 times as much for any individual drugs. They're saying that the US consumers are financing all the innovation, and that's got to change. And basically, he said, I have something called the most favoured nation letter. We don't want to pay more than anyone else pays. So that either means that drug prices will go massively down in the US or massively up elsewhere in the world, probably a bit of both. And that has got and by the way, says Donald Trump, if you want to invest anywhere in the world, you better invest here. And the net result of that has been people like Merck, big US company, cancelling but literally this project had already started and they walked off and abandoned a £1 billion plant in London. AstraZeneca, didn't do a £450 million plant in Merseyside about a year ago. They've just cancelled paused a £200 million plant here. You've got the likes of Eli Lilly, huge company in the US, described the UK as probably the worst country in Europe for drug pricing. Others saying it's uninvestable. And so, suddenly ministers are now gathering around. I managed to get a few words with Wes Streeting yesterday. I spoke to Patrick Vallance, Lord Vallance, remember him from COVID era. And they said, listen, we understand this is a very important situation. There's a live discussion going on between the Department of Health, the Treasury, Department for Science, Innovation, Technology, and the Americans on a bilateral basis to try and sort this out. So they think this is a bit of, and it's quite embarrassing. This is a sector that we think we excel in. And actually, there's what looks like an exodus of investment money going out the other way.
And let's listen to a bit of your conversation with Lord Vallance, the minister.
There's absolutely day-by-day discussions going on, including with industry, including with the US, to try to come to a solution here that's right for innovation, right for getting companies into the UK, and right for patients in the NHS. And that's what we're working on. I've got no doubt we'll come to some arrangement which gets to the right position on this, because we have to, because it's one of our great industries, one of the great success stories of what the UK can do, and because it's the most relevant thing to actually improving health in the UK.
Is it embarrassing for a government that declares that life sciences is a crown jewel and it wants to be a superpower for some companies to call this country uninvestable?
Well, I don't think people are saying it's uninvestable. I don't
They
think
are saying
well,
that.
They're saying they do not.
Saying that. Novartis is
well,
saying
actually,
that.
what they're saying is they do not want to invest at the moment until this commercial environment's fixed. That's a different thing from uninvestable. And if you look at what's happened here, if you look at BioNTech that have put $1 billion into this, if you look at Prologis, who announced $3 billion for the Cambridge Biomedical Science Park, people are investing. We've also got investors coming back to the UK from the US to invest. So there are investable propositions here. The basics are right. We know that people want to invest here. We need to get the commercial environment right. That's what we need to get fixed.
So basically, if I get this right, there's quite a few things happening in the global pharmaceutical industry, one of which is Donald Trump, one of which is this negotiation between the NHS and the drug companies. And it's kind of all come together and come to a head at this point. And from that clip with Patrick Vallance, it sounds like maybe the government is going to take a slightly less hard position in their negotiations over the price of drugs on the NHS. Yeah. That's not the white flag going right the way up to the flagpole, but it is being shown and waved around.
Yeah, because Wes Streeting had said in this kind of standoff with drug companies, he took it, very resolutely. He said, "I'm not going to stand by and let pharma companies rip off taxpayers." Well, I spoke to him yesterday, much more conciliatory tone. He said, "There's a live conversation. We know we've got to do something about this. I think a deal will be done soon." Patrick Vallance said much the same. Now, does that mean if they do something that the companies we just mentioned are going to turn around, "Oh, all right, then here's your £1 billion"? I don't think so. I mean, in a way, this will be a test of how much is the push factor out of the UK and how much is the pull factor into the US.
Yeah, because I'll be honest, I thought when I saw those reports about all those facilities being mothballed or the pause button being put on even building them, I thought, oh, this is a tactic by the companies to get a better deal in the negotiations about the drug pricing. I think I'd underestimated all the other factors that mean it actually might just be a bit more of a permanent thing rather than a tactical thing.
I mean, you've seen this in, basically Trump has said in no uncertain terms, he said, equalization, this is a term I've just come up with, a term I invented, he said. I want to make sure that we don't pay more than other people. And it's America first, it's getting a raw deal, blah, blah, blah. You know the rhetoric and the position he takes. And it's definitely got the drug companies on the hop. They will, but it is true to say, and there are some facts around this, that the percentage of the NHS budget that is spent on medicines is 9%. 10 years ago, it was 15%. So it's 9% now. In Germany and France, it's around 17%. And people say, but it's a hard sell. You need to spend more money on drugs. The drug companies would say, if we give people the right medicine, they won't end up in hospital. That will save you money. So it's a bit of a wash. So that's where we are with that argument.
But again, everything seems to come back to the budget now. And it's like it's more pressure on Rachel Reeves because every extra pound the NHS has to spend on drugs, that's a pound less it can spend on cutting the waiting lists.
Yeah. Well,
that's more pressure on spending.
The industry says, if you get the right medicines to the right people, they don't end up in the waiting list in the first place.
So interesting. Simon, thank you.
Thank you, Adam.